The alien queen had spent most of her life above the skies, surrounded by shining metal walls, loyal attendants, and the comfort of technology that could solve almost every problem. Her name was Eliara, and she was known across the stars as a figure of grace and wisdom. On this particular journey, she had been traveling on a diplomatic mission hidden from public view because secrecy was important. Only a few trusted companions knew her path, but fate is strange, and even the strongest ships can fail. Her vessel shuddered as alarms rang. Bright sparks flashed across the control panels, and the voices of her guards filled the air with worry. Eliara tried to remain calm, her silver eyes watching as the stars outside blurred and twisted. The pilot shouted something about an energy surge. Before she could ask what was happening, the ship tilted sharply, as if the universe itself had grabbed it and was pulling it down. The Queen held tightly to her seat as the vessel broke through a layer of atmosphere. Fire roared outside the windows. The sound of metal groaning filled the cabin. One by one, the systems went dark, and then, impact. The ship struck the surface of a world unknown. The crash was violent, yet she survived. When Eliara opened her eyes, she found herself lying among twisted pieces of the ship. Smoke rose from broken wires, and a faint smell of burned metal filled her nose. She coughed weakly and tried to stand. Her long ceremonial robe was torn, and her crown, symbol of her station, was gone. She pressed a hand against her side and felt pain. She was hurt but alive. The world around her was unlike any she had known. Above her stretched a wide blue sky. Instead of steel walls, there were tall trees with green leaves moving gently in the wind. She could hear the distant sound of running water and the songs of creatures she did not recognize. She had landed on a primitive world. Eliara's first thought was survival. Her people would be searching for her, but she could not wait without action. She stumbled away from the wreck, searching for shelter. Each step was heavy, and the ground was uneven beneath her soft boots. The forest seemed endless, yet also full of hidden life. Strange winged creatures circled overhead. Small animals darted between the bushes. Everything felt so alive and raw compared to the polished silence of her palace. Hours passed. Weakness spread through her body, and her vision blurred. She sank down against a tree, her mind filled with questions. Would her people find her? Would she survive long enough for them to reach her? It was then that she noticed movement. At first, Eliara thought it was another forest animal, but as the figure drew closer, she saw it was something different, something she had only read about in ancient reports. It was a human. The being stood taller than she expected, his skin darkened by the sun, his clothing made of stitched hides. He carried no shining weapons, no advanced equipment, only a spear carved from wood and stone. His hair was long and tangled, and his eyes were sharp, like someone who had spent his life watching the wild world carefully. The human stopped a few steps away from her. His expression showed both curiosity and caution. Eliara felt her heart race. She knew about humans only from the archives of her people. They were considered primitive, still young among the stars, unworthy of attention in the great courts of her empire, and yet here one stood, looking at her as if she were simply another traveler who had lost her way. The Queen tried to speak, but her language was strange to his ears. The human tilted his head listening, but then shook it slightly. They could not understand each other. She reached out a trembling hand, hoping he would recognize her weakness. For a long moment, the human did not move. Then, slowly, he lowered his spear and stepped closer. He studied her injuries, then knelt beside her. His hands were rough, yet gentle as he touched her arm, checking the wound. His eyes softened. Without words, he seemed to understand that she needed help. He pointed toward the forest, then looked back at her. His expression was clear. He was offering to take her with him. Eliara hesitated. She was a queen, used to guards, advisors, and machines that obeyed her commands. Yet here she was, powerless and alone, facing a stranger from a species her people barely respected. She realized she had no choice. If she refused, she might not survive the night. With effort, she nodded. The human carefully helped her rise. His strength surprised her. Though his tools were simple, his body carried the power of someone who lived by survival every day. Step by step, he guided her through the forest, supporting her when she stumbled. They passed streams of clear water, fields of wildflowers, and trees so tall they seemed to touch the sky. To Eliara, it was both terrifying and strangely beautiful. Finally, they reached a small clearing where a shelter of wood and leaves stood. Smoke rose from a quiet fire at its center. This was his home. The human guided her to sit near the fire. He offered her a drink of cool water from a carved container and placed herbs gently against her wound. Elyara flinched at first, unsure of his methods, but then felt the soothing effect of the plants. As the firelight flickered, she watched him move with calm skill. Every action was simple but filled with purpose. He needed no machines, no servants, no titles. He lived with what the world gave him, and he survived. That night, as the stars returned above the forest, Elyara lay near the fire, her body aching, but her mind awake. She looked at the human who had saved her. He did not know her name, her rank, or her power. To him, she was just a stranger who needed help. And for the first time in many years, Elyara felt something new: humility. The queen of the stars had fallen, yet a human of the earth had lifted her up. She wondered what the alien king, her consort who commanded fleets and armies, would think if he saw this moment. A powerful queen rescued not by warriors or technology, but by the hands of someone her empire called primitive. But Elyara knew the truth. There was nothing primitive about the kindness and courage she had witnessed that day, and somewhere deep inside her, a thought grew stronger. Perhaps humanity's greatest strength was not their tools or their knowledge, but their heart. The first night in the human's shelter was unlike anything Queen Elyara had ever experienced. She was used to soft, silken bedding, the low hum of machines that maintained perfect air temperature, and attendants waiting silently outside her chamber. Here she lay on a simple surface made of woven grass and animal hide, warmed only by the flickering firelight. Every sound from the forest, an owl's call, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of some unseen creature, reached her ears clearly. At first she could not sleep. Her mind returned again and again to the crash, the sudden loss of her ship, and the faces of the guards who had been with her. Were they gone? Were they searching for her? Would the king know she was still alive? But then her eyes drifted to the human. He sat across the fire, his spear resting at his side, watching the shadows carefully. His posture was alert, as though danger could appear at any moment. Yet his expression was calm, his eyes thoughtful. Elyara realized he was not guarding himself. He was guarding her. A queen of the stars lying helpless in his shelter was being protected by someone who knew nothing about her. At last, exhaustion overtook her. She slept. When morning came, Elyara woke to the smell of food. The human had roasted some kind of root and placed it near her. It looked simple and rough, but hunger pressed at her. She tasted it carefully. The flavor was earthy, far from the refined meals of her palace, yet strangely satisfying. She looked at him and gave a small nod of thanks. The human smiled faintly, as if he understood. Over the next days, Elyara learned to watch him closely. Without words, she began to understand pieces of his life. He rose with the sun, checked traps he had set for small animals, collected fruits and roots from the forest, and returned to the shelter before nightfall. Every action followed a rhythm, shaped by the land around him. At first, Elyara felt helpless. She could not hunt, could not gather, and could barely walk without leaning on his arm. But slowly, something inside her shifted. She began to try small tasks, sorting the gathered fruits, carrying water in a carved bowl, arranging firewood. The human encouraged her with simple gestures, his expression showing approval when she succeeded. It was strange for Elyara. Back in her empire, her hands had never known such work. She had been a queen shielded from labor. Yet here, each small action gave her a sense of strength. She was no longer only a guest, she was part of survival. Communication remained a challenge. The human spoke words she could not understand, while she answered in her own language. But even without shared speech, they found ways to connect. When Elyara wanted water, she drew a wave shape in the dirt. He would nod and bring her to the stream. When she wanted to know the word for fire, she pointed to the flames and he said it slowly. She repeated the sound until he smiled. Day by day, their silent language grew. One evening, as they sat near the fire, Elyara tried to tell him about the stars. She pointed upward, tracing patterns with her finger. Then she drew shapes in the dirt, lines connecting points, forming constellations. The human watched quietly, his eyes wide. He touched his chest, then pointed to the sky as if asking, "You came from there?" Elyara placed her hand over her heart and nodded. Yes. For a long time he stared at her, the firelight dancing across his face. She wondered what he thought. Did he believe her? Or did he see her as only a strange traveler with wild stories? Either way, he did not laugh. Instead, he looked at the stars again, thoughtful as though the sky had just grown larger in his mind. The Queen's wound slowly healed under his care. He brought herbs that eased the pain and bound the injury with cloth made from animal hide. Though the methods were simple, her body responded well. She realized that while her empire trusted machines for healing, the Earth itself still held answers. One afternoon, Eliara tried to show her gratitude. While he was away checking his traps, she gathered flowers and placed them around the shelter, arranging them into simple patterns. When he returned, his eyes widened in surprise. For the first time, she saw him laugh, a warm, genuine sound that filled the clearing. It was not the polite laughter of courtiers, nor the formal acknowledgement of diplomats. It was pure joy, and Eliara felt herself smiling too. The days turned into weeks. The bond between Queen and human grew stronger, though words still escaped them. She began to see him not as primitive, but as someone shaped by the strength of nature itself. He knew how to find food when the forest seemed empty, how to read the wind for signs of weather, and how to move silently among the trees. One evening, a storm swept across the land. Rain poured from the sky, lightning flashed, and thunder rolled like drums. Eliara had never felt nature so close, so wild. The human worked quickly, strengthening the shelter with extra branches covering the fire to keep it alive. She tried to help, though the rain soaked her robe and left her shivering. When the storm grew fierce, he motioned for her to sit close to the fire while he stood guard at the entrance, his spear ready. Eliara realized then, this was what true guardianship looked like. Not soldiers in shining armor, but someone who stood firm even when the world itself seemed to rage. By morning, the storm had passed, and the forest sparkled with fresh light. Eliara looked at him, her heart filled with quiet respect. He had no crown, no title, yet he carried a strength that her empire often forgot, the strength of endurance. As the days passed, Eliara began to wonder if her people would ever find her. She thought of the alien king, her consort, who commanded fleets across the stars. What would he think if he saw her now, sitting by a fire learning to weave leaves into baskets, guided by a human he might dismiss as primitive? And yet a strange thought grew inside her. Perhaps she was meant to be here. Perhaps this was not a punishment but a lesson. One night under the vast sky, Eliara looked at the stars with new eyes. She used to see them as territories, resources, and symbols of power. Now she saw them as lights that connected all beings, great and small, advanced and simple. And beside her sat the human, who had shown her more about survival and kindness than any court advisor ever had. Eliara closed her eyes, listening to the forest. For the first time since her crash, she felt not fear but peace. She was no longer just a queen waiting to be rescued. She was a traveler sharing a journey, guided by the hands of someone her empire had underestimated. And deep within her heart, she knew. This unlikely shelter had already changed her forever. The days passed, and the forest became less of a mystery for Queen Eliara. She still felt out of place among the trees and rivers, but her fear had slowly faded. What had once been a terrifying wilderness was now a world she was beginning to understand, thanks to the human who guided her. Yet, there was still one great wall between them: language. Every time Eliara tried to explain something complex, the words tumbled out of her mouth like broken glass. The human would tilt his head, frown in thought, then shake it slightly, showing he could not understand. Likewise, his speech was full of sounds and rhythms that carried meaning for him but not for her. Still, they did not give up. One morning, Eliara sat by the fire and pointed at the flames. She said clearly in her tongue, "Fire." The human watched, then touched his chest and spoke a word from his language. Eliara repeated it awkwardly, her accent strange. He laughed softly, not unkindly, but in amusement. Then he repeated the word slower. She tried again. This time he nodded in approval. Eliara smiled. For the first time they had shared the same word. From that moment, their days included not only survival but lessons. The human would bring her objects, stones, leaves, fruit, or tools, and say their names. Eliara listened carefully and repeated them. Sometimes she failed and he shook his head. Sometimes she succeeded and he smiled. Slowly a tiny dictionary grew in her mind. She learned how he called water, tree, sky, bird, and many more. In return, Ilyara began teaching him words from her own language. She would point to the stars at night and whisper their name in her tongue. He tried to repeat them, though his voice stumbled on the unfamiliar sounds. Yet she did not laugh. Instead, she encouraged him, nodding each time he made progress. Through these exchanges, their connection deepened. Language was no longer just a tool for speaking. It became a bridge between their worlds. One afternoon, the human showed her how to make a simple tool. He took a sharp stone, tied it carefully to a wooden stick using strong fibers, and handed it to her. Then he motioned for her to try. Ilyara studied his knots, her fingers clumsy at first, but she copied him until the tool was firm. He spoke a word, his word for spear. Ilyara repeated it, holding the finished tool with pride. Then she pointed to it and gave him her word for blade. He repeated after her. They looked at each other and laughed, realizing that the tool now had two names, his and hers. At night, their lessons grew more personal. Sitting under the stars, Ilyara tried to share pieces of her story. She pointed upward, tracing the shapes of constellations with her finger. She drew her ship in the dirt, a simple oval with wings, then pressed her hand against her heart and pointed again to the sky. The human's eyes widened. Slowly he pointed to her, then to the stars, as if asking, "You came from there?" Ilyara nodded. He was silent for a long time. His eyes lifted to the heavens, filled with wonder. He had always known the stars as lights in the distance, mysterious and unreachable. Now, sitting beside him was someone who had fallen from those very lights. Though he could not speak her story in words, his expression showed that he believed her. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. Ilyara no longer felt like a stranger in the shelter. She had become part of its daily rhythm. She helped gather food, carried water, and even learned how to weave grass into simple mats. The human guided her patiently, correcting her mistakes with gentle gestures. In turn, she shared with him fragments of her knowledge. Using sticks and stones, she explained simple principles of the stars, how planets moved, how ships traveled through space. Of course, she could not show him the full truth without her technology, but her drawings made his eyes shine with curiosity. For Ilyara, it was a strange reversal. Back in her empire, knowledge was power, carefully guarded. Here she gave it freely, not as a ruler but as a friend. One evening, something unusual happened. A small bird with bright feathers fell near the shelter. Its wing was hurt. Ilyara bent down to pick it up gently, cradling it in her hands. The human came closer, watching. Together, they tried to help the creature. The human used thin strips of bark to bind its wing, while Ilyara whispered softly, her voice calm. They placed the bird in a safe corner of the shelter. Over the next days, they fed it tiny seeds and water. When at last the bird's wing healed, they released it into the air. It flew away, disappearing into the forest. Ilyara looked at the human and saw a light in his eyes. They had not only survived together, they had given life a second chance. That small act became a symbol between them. It was proof that even without words, they shared the same values: care, kindness, and respect for life. By now, Ilyara had stopped thinking of him as the human. In her mind, he had become more than that. He was her guide, her protector, and her teacher. She wished she knew his true name. One evening, as the fire crackled, she pointed to herself and said, "Ilyara." Then she pointed at him, waiting. He seemed surprised, then touched his chest. "Kyle," he said slowly. "Kyle," she repeated. His smile showed approval. From that night on, she thought of him not as a nameless figure, but as Kale. Their connection grew deeper each day. Ilyara found herself noticing small details. The way Kyle always checked the fire before sleeping, the way his eyes scanned the forest with quiet focus, the way he laughed when she mispronounced a word but never mocked her. Kale, in turn, began to look at Ilyara differently. He had seen her first as a wounded stranger, fragile and lost. But now he saw her strength and her determination to learn, her patience when she failed, and her courage when storms shook the land. They were from different worlds, yet they were no longer strangers. One night the stars shone brighter than usual. The sky seemed endless, filled with light. Ilyara and Kale sat side by side, their fire burning low. She traced a constellation in the air and whispered its name in her tongue. Kale repeated it clumsily, then pointed to another star and gave her his word for it. They laughed together, then fell into silence. In that silence, Elyara felt something she had not known in a long time: peace. For once, she was not a queen carrying the weight of an empire. She was simply Elyara, sitting beside Kale, sharing the wonder of the universe. It was in that moment she realized something profound. Connection did not require perfect words. It did not require crowns, palaces, or fleets of ships. Connection was built in small gestures, shared effort, and quiet understanding. And here, in a shelter made of wood and leaves, she had found a connection stronger than any alliance her empire had ever forged. The quiet life in the forest had lasted many weeks. To Elyara, the days with Kyle no longer felt strange but natural. She had grown used to the rhythm of rising with the sun, gathering food and sitting by the fire at night. She had even learned enough of his words to speak simple sentences, and he had picked up fragments of hers. They were still far from fluent, but their bond made language less important. And yet, deep inside, Elyara knew this peace could not last forever. Somewhere beyond the sky, her people were searching. The alien king, her consort, would not rest until she was found. Elyara did not know whether to feel comfort or worry at this thought. One morning, the answer came. It began with a sound unlike anything Kale had ever heard. A low hum rolled across the forest, shaking the branches. Birds burst from the trees in flocks, their cries filling the air. Elyara froze. Her eyes widened, her breath caught in her throat. She knew that sound well. It was the hum of an approaching starship. Kale gripped his spear and looked to the sky, confusion on his face. For him, the sound was terrifying and unknown. For Elyara, it was familiar, but it filled her with mixed feelings. Rescue had come, yes, but it meant the end of the world she had come to know. They stepped out of the shelter and looked up. Breaking through the clouds came a shining vessel, silver and vast, its lights glowing against the blue sky. To Kale, it seemed like a star that had fallen to Earth. To Elyara, it was a reminder of the life she had left behind. The ship descended into a clearing not far from their shelter. The hum grew louder until at last it landed with a hiss of steam. Elyara's heart pounded. She knew who would step out. The king. A group of alien guards emerged first, their armor gleaming. They formed a circle of protection around the figure who followed. He was tall and commanding, his presence strong even without words. His crown reflected the light and his robe shimmered with patterns of royal power. It was Elyara's consort, King Thalen. He walked forward with long, certain strides, his eyes scanning the forest until they fell on her. For a moment, his stern face softened. His queen, his partner, was alive. Relief flickered in his gaze. But then his eyes shifted to Kale. The sight made him pause. Elyara stood beside the human, her hand lightly touching Kale's arm for support. Her robe was torn, her crown was gone, yet she carried herself with calm dignity. Kale, in his simple hide, stood tall with his wooden spear, looking back at the king without fear. Thalen's brows furrowed. His queen, rescued not by his fleet, not by his warriors, but by a single human, one of the primitives his empire often ignored. The idea unsettled him. The guards moved forward, their weapons ready, but Elyara raised her hand. In a firm voice, she stopped them. Though she looked fragile compared to their shining armor, her authority was unquestionable. The guards froze, waiting. The king stepped closer. "Elyara," he said in his tongue, his voice deep. "You are alive. At last we have found you," she nodded slowly. "Yes, I am alive. Because of him." She turned her gaze toward Kale. Thalen's eyes narrowed. "Because of him?" Elyara spoke with steady calm. "When my ship fell, I was wounded and alone. Your fleets were far. Your armies were not here. But this human, he was. He gave me shelter. He healed me. He kept me safe." The king looked at Kale again, his expression unreadable. To him, Kale was little more than a hunter of the wilds, with no knowledge of technology or the stars. Yet here was his queen, speaking with gratitude, her voice carrying respect for the human. Kale did not understand their words, but he understood their tone. He could sense the tension in the air. His grip on his spear tightened, not out of aggression but out of instinct. Elyara saw this and gently touched his hand, a silent sign that all was well. Thalen noticed the gesture. It struck him deeper than he expected. His queen, who had always walked among courts and palaces, now stood close beside a human, her trust given freely. The king tried to regain his composure. "Come, Elyara, Let us return to the ship. You do not belong in this wilderness, but Ilyara did not move. She looked around at the shelter, the fire, and the forest that had been her home for so many days. She thought of the lessons Kale had taught her, how to gather, how to survive, how to listen to the land. She thought of the nights they had shared under the stars, speaking in gestures, building a language of their own. At last she turned back to the king. Her voice was quiet but firm. I do belong here, at least for a time. This place, this human, has shown me things I had forgotten. Things our empire overlooks. The king was silent. He had expected tears of relief or eagerness to return. Instead, he found himself facing a queen who spoke not of power or rescue, but of gratitude for a primitive. Ilyara stepped forward, motioning for Kale to join her. She introduced him with simple words, naming him as Kale. Though Thalan did not repeat the name, he could see the weight it carried for her. Kale, though unable to understand, bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect. The act was simple, but it carried dignity. The king studied him. In Kale's eyes there was no fear, no desire for wealth, no hunger for power, only quiet strength. That strength had been enough to protect Ilyara when fleets and armies could not reach her. For the first time, Thalan felt a flicker of something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. The guards waited for orders. The king gave none. He stood there, caught between pride and truth. Finally, Ilyara broke the silence. He saved me. That cannot be ignored. His kindness, his courage, without them I would not stand before you now. Thalan exhaled slowly. His eyes moved once more to Kale, then back to his queen. Very well, he said at last. The human will be honored. Ilyara nodded, though she knew honor in words was not enough. What mattered was the story, the truth of what had happened. And she would make sure that truth was never forgotten. As the sun dipped low, the forest grew quiet again. The ship stood waiting, its silver frame gleaming. The king's arrival had changed everything, yet in Ilyara's heart, one truth remained. The bond she had found with Kale was real. She was a queen of the stars, yet she had been rescued by a human of the earth, and now even the king could not deny it. The forest was quiet once more, yet a sense of change lingered in the air. Ilyara stood in the clearing, looking at Kale and then at King Thalan, her heart steady. The last few days had been filled with tension and discovery, but now it was time for the truth to be acknowledged. She remembered the long journey from the crash to this moment. She thought of the pain, the fear, and the nights spent under the stars, learning to trust someone so different from herself. Kyle had not only saved her life, he had taught her patience, resilience, and respect for the strength that exists in the simplest forms. And now she would honor him. Ilyara turned to the king first. His expression was still unreadable, a mixture of pride, disbelief, and caution. Thalan had expected to find a queen in need of rescue, perhaps trembling or scared. Instead, he saw her standing tall, calm, and clear-eyed, beside someone he had once thought insignificant. She spoke carefully, her voice carrying the authority of her station and the sincerity of her experience. Thalan, I am grateful for your fleet and your concern, but it was not your soldiers or your machines that kept me alive. It was Kyle. His courage, his care, and his wisdom saved me. I cannot return without acknowledging the truth. The king studied Kale closely. The human's posture was relaxed but confident. His eyes met the king's without fear or arrogance. Thalan realized slowly that Kale possessed a quality his empire often overlooked: quiet strength, born not of technology or power but of heart and mind. Kyle, though not understanding every word, sensed the importance of the moment. He stood tall, hands empty, nothing to boast of but his presence and his honesty. He had never sought glory or recognition, yet here in front of the queen and her consort, his actions spoke louder than words ever could. Ilyara placed a hand on Kyle's arm, a silent signal of acknowledgement and respect. You see, Thalan, she said, it is not always the strongest weapon or the largest fleet that matters. Sometimes it is the one who cares, who acts with patience, who protects without seeking reward. That is what true strength is. The king exhaled slowly. He had faced many crises, commanded fleets, and solved countless conflicts. Yet here was a truth that could not be measured in numbers or technology. Here was a lesson delivered by someone his empire might have dismissed as weak. For a long moment, the three of them stood silently. The sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the forest with golden light. The birds were quiet, as if even nature itself paused to witness the moment. Finally, Thalen spoke, his voice softer than before. "Then it is as you say. The human will be honored, not because he is extraordinary in wealth or power, but because he is extraordinary in courage and heart. That is worth recognition in any world, no matter how advanced." Iliara nodded. She smiled at Kale, who blinked, unsure of the meaning but sensing the kindness in her tone. Over the next days, preparations began. Iliara insisted that Kale accompany her to her people. The forest had been his home, and leaving it would be a great step. Yet she promised him that his life would not change in a way that would harm him. He would be respected for who he was, not forced into a court he did not understand. The journey to the landing site was quiet, but the bond between Iliara and Kale had grown unspoken. They walked side by side, gathering small herbs for the Queen's journey and sharing moments of laughter when she stumbled on a root or he nearly tripped on a stone. The king observed silently, studying the human. He had been trained to judge quickly, yet now he realized that Kale's strength was subtle, almost invisible, yet undeniable. It was patience, kindness, courage, and intelligence combined, not flashy but real. When the starship's ramp descended, Iliara stood at the top, gesturing for Kale to follow. She spoke softly so only he could hear. "This is your choice, Kyle. You do not have to come, but if you do, my people will know your truth." Kyle looked at the stars, then at the forest he had called home. He thought of the fire, the shelter, and the moments shared with Iliara. Then he nodded. It was not for glory, but for friendship and respect. Together they stepped onto the ship. Inside the vessel, Iliara's people gasped. Here was their queen, rescued not by fleets, not by strategy, but by a human. The sight of Kale standing calm and composed among beings who looked down on him created a stir. Iliara spoke, her voice carrying authority and clarity. "He is Kale. He saved my life. Without him, I would not stand here today. I ask that you honor him, not for titles, not for power, but for courage, kindness, and wisdom." Murmurs ran through the assembly. Some were skeptical, others astonished. But the truth of Iliara's words could not be denied. Kale had acted when it mattered without expectation or reward. That was a lesson that could not be ignored. Over time, Kale's presence among Iliara's people changed many hearts. Children listened as he told simple stories of the forest. Scholars asked about his knowledge of nature, of survival, and of observation. And everywhere, the tale of the human who had saved a queen spread. The king, though initially unsettled, began to see the wisdom in Iliara's choice. He learned that strength came in many forms, not only in fleets, armies, or technology. Sometimes it came in the form of a quiet, determined being who acted with integrity. Iliara smiled quietly to herself. She had not only survived, but she had learned, and Kale had not only saved her life, but he had taught an empire a truth they had almost forgotten. One night, beneath the stars that had once guided Iliara's journey, she and Kale sat together. She spoke in simple words, the ones he had learned, and he listened carefully. They did not need long speeches. The bond they shared was stronger than any language. "I am grateful," Iliara said softly. Kyle nodded. "You are alive." "Yes," she replied, smiling. "Because of you." And Kyle understood. The story of Iliara and Kyle spread across worlds. It was told not as a tale of conquest or power, but as a story of courage, kindness, and the quiet triumph of humanity. Iliara's empire learned that greatness was not measured by technology or fleets, but by actions and heart. And for Kale, who had never sought reward or recognition, the respect and gratitude of a queen and her people became a legacy far greater than he had ever imagined. In the end, the forest remained in his memory, the fire still flickered in his thoughts, and the stars above reminded him that even a single being, acting with courage and kindness, could change worlds. And so, humanity's quiet triumph was remembered, not in war or power, but in the courage to act, the wisdom to care, and the heart to protect, even when the universe seemed vast and indifferent. Queen Iliara and Kale had shown that true strength is often hidden, and that the smallest acts of kindness can shine brighter than the stars themselves.